This move immediately stakes a claim in the center, opens lines for the queen and bishop, and invites a wide range of responses from black, setting the stage for dynamic tactical and strategic play. This move prepares to challenge white's central pawn with d5, aiming for an active pawn structure and control of key central squares. This move establishes a strong central pawn presence, aiming to control key squares and open lines for rapid piece development, characteristic of the Caro-Kann defense's main lines. This move, 2, d5, immediately challenges white's central pawn and leads to the classical variation of the Caro-Kann defense, aiming for rapid pawn equality and active piece play. This move develops the knight to a more flexible square, supporting the central pawn and preparing for a potential queenside expansion or a solidifying setup in the center, typical of the Caro-Kann defense. This captures the pawn, opening the d-file for potential future piece activity and clarifying the central pawn structure. This recapture is a solid choice, developing the knight to a strong central square and challenging black's central pawn presence. Immediately, this move, 4, nd7, follows the standard repertoire for black in the classical Caro-Kann, aiming to support the d5 pawn and prepare for development of the kingside pieces. This aggressive knight sortie to g5 immediately challenges black's f7 pawn, a common weak point, while also preparing potential sacrifices to open lines against the king. This developing move reinforces the center and prepares to contest the powerful knight on g5, aiming to simplify the position and improve piece coordination. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces the central pawn and prepares to castle kingside, following standard opening principles after white's unusual knight maneuver to g5. This move initiates the king's Indian attack setup, aiming to fianchetto the dark squared bishop to g7 to control the long diagonal and often prepare a kingside pawn storm. This move reinforces the knight on g5 and prepares to develop the light squared bishop, aiming to control the center and prepare for kingside castling. Developing the bishop to g7 fianchetto aims to control the long diagonal and prepare for castling, a common strategy in this Caro-Kann variation to activate the bishop and challenge white's central control. This move initiates an aggressive centralizing strategy, aiming to put immediate pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the king. This move develops the knight to a less active square, potentially allowing white to exploit the central pawn structure and queen's pressure on the queenside. Developing the bishop to e2 prepares for kingside castling and supports the knight on g5, reinforcing white's central influence and preparing for further development. Black castles kingside, solidifying the king's safety and preparing to connect the rooks for future action, a standard maneuver in many gambit lines arising from the Caro-Kann. Castling kingside is a natural development, securing the king and connecting the rooks for future action. This move activates the knight to a more central square, preparing to contest white's control of the d4 square and potentially exploit weaknesses in white's kingside structure. The rook on d1 is brought to a more active central file, potentially supporting a d5 pawn push or preparing to exchange on e4 if white decides to redeploy the knight. This move prepares to connect the rooks and also supports the potential advance of the f-pawn, increasing pressure on white's central pawn structure. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop, reinforcing the kingside defenses and potentially creating a strong diagonal for future attacking possibilities. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest white's control of d4 and potentially support an advance of the d-pawn. This knight maneuver prepares to contest the central squares and potentially pressure black's pawn on d6 after developing the knight to a more active outpost. This move challenges white's central knight and aims to open lines for black's pieces, creating counterplay in the center and on the queenside. This capture opens the d-file and challenges black's central pawn, potentially leading to a more dynamic pawn structure and increased activity for white's pieces. This move recaptures the pawn, but it repositions the queen to a more active square where it eyes the kingside and can support pawn breaks, while also threatening the white knight on e5. This move, nd3, strategically repositions the knight to a central square, aiming to support the d4 pawn and potentially attack black's queenside. This move re-establishes contact with white's queen, aiming to create immediate tactical opportunities and potentially exchange queens or pieces to simplify the position. This knight maneuver prepares to challenge black's central influence and potentially support a pawn break in the center, aiming to improve white's piece activity. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, eyeing the queenside and preparing to support future pawn advances or piece maneuvers. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns and prepare for potential pawn breaks or piece exchanges to open lines for white's rooks. This move actively challenges white's queen and prepares to redeploy the knight to a more central square, potentially targeting white's queenside pawn structure. The queen aggressively reoccupies the b4 square, threatening the knight on c6 and the pawn on circa 5, forcing black to defend and potentially leading to a structural concession. This move simplifies the position by trading queens, which might be beneficial for black as white's queen on b4 was quite active and potentially threatening. This pawn exchange simplifies the position, opening the c-file for white's rook and creating a slightly healthier pawn structure by avoiding doubled pawns. With the queens off the board, white has a slight space advantage and better pawn structure on the queenside. So black seeks to activate their pieces, particularly the rooks on the open d-file, to counter white's positional grip. This rook move prepares to challenge the open b-file, aiming to contest control and potentially create counterplay against black's queenside pawn structure. This move repositions the knight to a more active square where it can contest the central control and prepare for potential piece exchanges on the queenside. This move prepares to double rooks on the d-file, aiming to exert pressure on black's central pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control central squares and potentially attack white's queenside structure. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting the pawn push on g4 and preparing to contest the central squares or support a queenside expansion. This move 22, nc4 is an excellent tactical idea, immediately challenging white's knight on e5 and aiming to exploit the potential weakness on d3. After exchanges, this exchange simplifies white's structure, opening the c-file for potential future play and eliminating black's active bishop. But it grants black a strong central outpost with their knight on d6. The recapture opens the c-file for black's rook and activates the bishop, aiming to contest the central squares and develop counterplay against white's potentially weak queenside pawns. This move reinforces the pawn on c3, creating a more solid structure and preparing to expand on the queenside, while also preventing nb5 and potentially opening lines for the rook. This move, nc3, strikes directly at white's queenside pawns, exploiting the vulnerable b3 pawn and threatening to win material if white is not careful. This move redeploys the rook from the contested d file to a more defensive and flexible square, reinforcing the b3 pawn and preparing for potential counterplay on the queenside. The bishop retreats to d5, maintaining its active diagonal and supporting the knight on c3, while also preparing to contest the queenside pawn majority for white. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, preparing to contest control of the semi-open c file and potentially support an advance of the b-pawn. This move develops the bishop to an active square, aiming to exchange white's well-placed knight on c3 and improve black's piece coordination in the endgame. This exchange of rooks simplifies the position by removing a piece that was actively controlling key squares and prepares to exploit the resulting pawn structure by developing the remaining rook to an open file. This rook exchange simplifies the position, which is generally favorable for black as it addresses white's slight space advantage in the isolated d-pawn that will soon arise. This rook move aims to control the open d-file, creating immediate pressure and preparing for potential exchanges or maneuvering into more active squares. This move simplifies the position by trading queens and rook, leading to a more open endgame where black must carefully defend against white's superior pawn majority on the queenside. This move liquidates the central tension and transitions into an endgame where white's slightly superior pawn structure on the queenside, with connected passed pawns on the b and c files, offers good long-term prospects. Black's knight sacrificial capture of the a2 pawn is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and create tactical complications, but it risks overextension if white can consolidate. This move aims to exploit black's exposed knight by creating a passed pawn on the queenside, forcing a decisive material imbalance or allowing white to regain the piece. This move reintroduces the knight into play from its somewhat passive square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities on the queenside. This move simplifies the position by trading off black's active bishop for white's less active one, aiming to improve white's pawn structure and potentially activate the light-squared bishop. Black recaptures the bishop, solidifying their central pawn majority and aiming to exploit the open c-file. The king now moves to a safer central square, avoiding potential checks and preparing to participate in the endgame by supporting pawns. The bishop effectively reclaims its position on the long diagonal, aiming to contest control of the central squares and prepare for potential pawn advances later in the game. The king ventures into the center, aiming to participate in the endgame play and potentially activate its mobility for future maneuvering. This move, bxb3, captures a pawn but surrenders control of the open b-file and allows white to potentially activate their rook on the now open file, complicating black's position. This move activates the king, preparing to support the queenside pawns and participate in the endgame by centralizing. The bishop retreats to a5, maintaining its diagonal influence and preparing to recapture the pawn on b3 should white's king or rook attempt to annex it. This move prepares to activate the knight, aiming to reposition it to a more central or aggressive square, likely targeting weaknesses in black's pawn structure or creating tactical opportunities. This exchange simplifies black's pawn structure and offers white a more active rook on the a-file. After the capture, white recaptures the pawn, simplifying into an endgame where the advantage lies with black's more active king and better pawn structure. Black's bishop captures the pawn, creating a favorable pawn structure for black in the endgame by centralizing the king and activating the remaining pieces. This knight's repositioning to a5 attacks the b3 pawn and prepares to contest the a file if it opens. The black bishop retreats to b6, aiming to maintain its influence on the queenside and potentially find a more active square on the a5 d8 diagonal later, while white's knight on a5 is currently poorly placed. This knight sacrifice exploits the vulnerable pawn structure on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create a passed pawn for white. This move repositions the king to a more active and secure central square, preparing to support the pawns in the endgame and potentially create new attacking chances. This move aims to centralize the king, activate it as a fighting piece in the endgame, and prepare to support the passed b-pawn's advance. The king's journey to the center is now complete, a standard endgame maneuver to activate the monarch for defense and potential pawn pushing. The king's active repositioning to b4 aims to centralize it, escort the passed b-pawn, and potentially exert pressure on black's queenside pawn majority. The king advances to the center, preparing to support the pawn majority on the queenside and potentially contest the opposition, which is crucial in an endgame where king activity dictates the outcome.